I didn't want to stop searching. And I just happened to hear another podcast, like a Joe Rogan podcast, and they were with a guest talking about ayahuasca. And at first, I just kind of listened to it with entertainment kind of value, and it was more about the seeing this crazy stuff. And at that point, I had no interest in psychedelics. I didn't see the point. For me, it viewed like escapism. I had friends in college or in high school that did it, and I was like, cool, man, that doesn't... Actually, I had the pride of not having done cannabis or psychedelics that, in my mind at that point, I didn't care if anybody else did it, but if I took drugs and I became a drug user, and that was a different self-view than I had at that point. So I heard this podcast, and I kind of cast it off. There was some talk about its benefits and all this, but it was kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Awesome. All right, 38 Challenge podcast on the go. We are at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver, Colorado with Jesse Gould. Jesse is a former Army Ranger and founder of the Heroic Hearts Project. Super excited for this conversation. I know. Thank you so much, Jesse, for stepping aside from the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great conference. Definitely need a nap and possibly longer, but it's been great to see people and seeing how far this space has come.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Obviously, we're just kind of 38 Challenge is just getting into it, and I'm new to the industry. So when I tell people I'm going to this, they're like, "You're doing what?" I was like, "A psychedelic science, baby." Yeah, it's about 50% people like you and I, that want to help others, or people who want to get in the industry, and then about 50% of people, wearing mushroom hats and walking around barefoot. So definitely a and very exciting atmosphere here.
Yeah, absolutely. Just coming from like the original conferences where it was much more of the psychonauts.
Yeah.
And then the researchers started coming in, but now you have like everywhere in between. So it's kind of cool to see the evolution. And the unique thing about this conference, for 11,000 people, which is for this space pretty huge.
Yeah, and I mean guys like Andrew Huberman speaking, and I mean Aaron Rodgers was here, so
and Jesse Gould.
Yeah, Jesse Gould. Yeah. That guy's awesome too. Yeah, man, super excited to hear your journey and how you got. So why don't you start with a little bit of brief history on your service?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, originally I was in finance, completely different field, but ended up joining the military. Went straight to becoming an Army Ranger. Did 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. I was a non-commissioned officer. So in charge of 30 plus junior rangers in training and overseas operations. As we'll relate to this conversation later, I was also a mortarman. So for those that aren't familiar, mortars are high angle trajectory rockets essentially. That, and then just being in special operations, I was exposed to a lot of concussive force and blasts and all sorts of things that we're seeing now are not necessarily good for the brain health.
Yeah, not good at all, man. So why go from finance to the military?
Military always intrigued me. It was just I always appreciated and respected people that went in when they didn't have to, especially that they gave to something bigger than themselves. I got out of college and I was working in Wall Street, and I just felt like there was something lacking. It was more of an intuition, put more of the pieces together post, but I think I was just really craving that becoming an adult, becoming a man ceremony or chapter in my life, which wasn't available because I didn't feel like that after college. And so I worked a little bit in finance. I liked it. I also had the fortune of getting around the 2009 financial crisis, so I got to see Wall Street burning while I was there.
Right.
And so it was just sort of the universe aligned where I had this feeling I wanted to give back because I felt very fortunate being in that position. And Wall Street wasn't going anywhere at that point. It's now or never, and just wanted that challenge too. So told my family, which was a shock to the system because we're not a military family, and generally speaking, most people who have college degrees don't enlist, but I wanted to do it. If I was going to do it, I was going to go full hog in up. So decided to do that, looked into it, did research, started preparing for it physically, mentally, and enlisted. And next thing I know was getting my head shaved and off on a bus and plane to Georgia.
Right. Yeah. Most people go from the battlefield to the boardroom, but you went from the boardroom to the battlefield, which is, I'm sure, not an easy, probably an easier transition, I guess, from battlefield to boardroom, but still not an easy one, and a much different lifestyle for sure.
I think it, at least for me, it helped that I had real world experience, so I could kind of, at least debatable, obviously, but I had the comparison, of what the outside world works. One of the hard parts about a lot of veterans is they go straight from high school,
Right.
and their whole maturity arc is in combat, and so when they get out, years to being a civilian and
Right.
the workforce. There was some challenges. My first team leader was Napoleon complex 19-year-old, and I was 22 and had this.
That'd
So
be
I
tough.
had to deal with that and
Yeah.
eat crow, but it's all
Absolutely, man. So before we kind of go into this, I'm sure, a very wild journey for you, I want to get a little context before we move forward in the conversation. So when you think of the word vulnerability, what does that mean to you?
I think it's taken different meanings. I mean, especially growing up as a man, and I mentioned sort of this lack of real leadership or real models from that. We get the sort of alpha male archetype of, being jacked and kind of like the Goggins. Nothing wrong with the Goggins.
Yeah.
Run till you can't run anymore,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
exactly. Yep.
Sort of, the stereotypical of like, you're a man, you got to do this, you got to like all that, and that's kind of what I grew up with. Definitely not my definition. So at first, vulnerability was just kind of like a weakness, right?
Right.
And especially in the military too. I think what it comes now is actually more self-understanding, openness. And I think vulnerability it's such a loaded thing because it does still, even when I'm saying it right now, almost connotate weakness, like you're exposing yourself, not in the perverted way.
Right.
But,
Yeah. That's a different vulnerability.
But it actually is you're able to share everything, right? And that is that's amazing.
Right.
Because you're not trying to put up walls, you're not trying to hide anything, you're not trying to disguise who you are. And it's almost authenticity, yourself. And I think when you do that, you attract other people that also do that. And I think they also appreciate it because we're afraid of each other in a lot of contexts.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that word authenticity gets used a lot on this podcast. I think of it the same way. I view it as strength. I don't know if I think of it as strength yet. Like you say, it still doesn't really roll off the tongue. But if you think about what it means to be vulnerable, like you said, it's to understand and to expose your weaknesses. And if you're not vulnerable and you don't, then how can you become strong, right? If you don't exploit the things that are holding you back, right? And showing your weaknesses and showing the places where you're most vulnerable allows other people, like you said, to do the same and allows them to be stronger. So I appreciate you willing to get vulnerable. And man, I think for men like you and I, the work that we do, usually has a backstory that's very close to home. So I'd love to know, kind of the darkness that I'm sure you've experienced, kind of where all that started.
And trauma is an interesting discussion because there's no starting point. I think in the Western mental health model, we try to find that, especially with like PTSD, of like what is the one thing that mess you up, where in fact there's probably many things.
Lots of things.
Hard, and it keeps throwing
R-rated.
Life
is R-rated.
Throwing its punches. So I mean, as a kid, I did suffer with like anxiety and various issues and belonging and um, social anxiety, all that kind of. Going into the military actually helped it with a lot of ways, just because it gave me the ground to stand on of knowing myself, of what I can do, what I can accomplish, what my limits are, and just a very good sense of self. And so that helped a lot. So no matter what, the military is, especially special operations, one, you're trained, you're indoctrinated to be not only a soldier and be in battle and potentially die, but you're also trained to be part of a unit, right? You're losing a lot of yourself, being more effective. It's there's no, uh, you know, there's obviously the certain cases in the movies, but it's not that one Rambo person just going in and killing all the bad guys. It's efficient tactics that make the difference
Right.
over the long term. Um, but yeah, so then yeah, coming from the military, that was the other side of it, where it's a work hard, play hard sort of mentality, big drinking culture. You go into it, you're exposed to that. I remember there was a time when I was on a helicopter to one of my first missions. I don't think it was the first, but one of the first. And I was anxious going into it. I'd done a lot of training up to that point, pitch black. But I just kind of took that big deep breath in and just let it out. Of at this point, it's not whether I live or die, right? I just have to fall back on training, and I just have to be cool with whatever goes on from then forward. And it was kind of a relief. But that's also a very strange mentality to live for multiple years.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter what, and whether it's in combat or people dying or stress of, the action there, or just the physical sides, going through Ranger School, I was in essentially 4 months of sleep deprivation, food deprivation, some weeks, 45 minutes of sleep for the whole week. Good for your body. And then
Yeah.
you're, knocking down MREs, which are filled with all sorts of fun chemicals. So all this you're getting out. Your body's hurting, your knees are worn out, your brain health is probably not doing that good. Your gut microbiome's super messed up. Your weird mental state, hypervigilance, inflammation from the stress, heightened everything, and also a separation from civilian life. And happy to go more into this, but one of the things we see with veterans kind of become the poster child, the rubber stamp of veteran trauma. But again, this is a much more complex issue, and so a lot of the things that people struggle with, that we serve, the veterans we serve, myself included, you get out of that, and you come from this brotherhood, sisterhood of very tight connections of liver, sometimes closer than the family. And you also come from this world of purpose, where you're on the front lines of world events, and each and every day you got to show up, and it's having, you can debate the impact, but it's having an impact on some pretty macro level
100%.
scale. And then you go out of that, and for me, going into corporate finance, one, isolation, and you're nowhere near dealing or bonding with the finance bros as I was with the other people.
Right.
But two was like, okay, I worked 80 hours this week and saved this company 50 cents on on the quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Good for me.
Right.
I'm having an impact.
Yeah, 100%. I think, like you said, I mean, it's just such a, people. I talk to people all the time. It's like veterans. It's like, oh, PTSD. It's like, well, yeah, and that's a very serious issue, obviously. But there's so much more to it. A lot of guys, especially in special operations, military to run, right? Or people, or like you said, even just people who are who are commissioning. Like you, you're a lot of times they're escaping something there, so they haven't addressed the trauma from their childhood, and then they go into the military and they experience more trauma, and again, everything that you just on top of that, they experience a ridiculous amount of brain injuries. So now you have to try to deal with that trauma and the anxiety and the depression that comes with it, with a brain that's now injured. And then you transition out and the uniform comes off and your whole world is completely changed. And now you have no idea where you fit into society. Exactly where my brother was, all those things, right? And that's, he's not a unique story by any means. And you get out, and I remember Matt tried so many different things and had no idea what his purpose was anymore. He's like, do I go back and do special operations again? Do I the NFL again? Because he was a football player. So he wants to go back to what his identity was, and you lose that identity. And then once you lose your identity, then what? On top of all the other things that we've discussed. So man, I'm curious, just kind of this storm for you. Did you experience PTSD? Was anxiety and depression a big thing for you? Kind of want to play around in that darkness a little bit and what it looked like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you brought up athletes and also really successful people in finance or the business world in general. We work many different people, our charter is veterans, but at the end of the day, certain people have certain spirits, and I feel like a lot of athletes are in the same boat as veterans. There's a reason.
Right.
Sometimes it's trauma based, but it's also they just have this strong energy, warrior spirit. And sports are, in an essence, mimicking war and battle.
Yeah,
right?
I was actually just having this conversation with a good buddy who played. He played, I won't say the school because I might give it up, but he played D1 football, experienced many brain injuries. Said that the amount of trauma that was in that locker room, the amount of people that he had to talk off of a ledge who were considering taking their lives. So again, it's the same issues, the exact same issues as the military. Maybe military is on a slightly more intense scale, but you still have brain injuries. A lot of people still have childhood trauma, and you're still lacking that camaraderie and that purpose. But yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we've worked with them, the veterans, athletes, successful business people, they bond really well. So it's always unique and great to see. Yeah, for me, I got out and, I think especially with my other experience and also just my self-understanding from issues I had before the military, I thought, okay, cool. I did well in Ranger, ranked up quick, had this financial background, had a great degree. I'm going to hit the ground running. Myself a little time too, traveled around, tried a few different, small ventures. You kind of have to fail a few before something's successful. But, I had that freedom and liberty to do that. I wasn't contracted by the government anymore.
Right.
And so I was taking advantage of that. And then eventually I found my way back. I was in Tampa, Florida, back to a real job just because of my ventures, my funds were starting to drain pretty quickly.
Right, that sucks.
And I was just also like, I had an economics degree, I had a finance background. I didn't want to lose it before it was too late, And so it was this big international company. We're in the financial analysis of all the branches. And so getting back into modeling and all the fun stuff on
Right.
Excel,
Yeah.
but I was also like a direct report almost of the CFO who liked me a lot and just had a positive career perspectives and got promotion, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it was the complete opposite of, like I said, the work hard, play hard of Ranger, and then all these issues that had already been there, but I was able to ignore by the challenges and excitement of traveling. And, that's kind of a constant party. Do a lot of self-reflection necessarily.
Yep.
And so, there I was and just having to show up as a real civilian. And I was like, oh shit, there seems to be something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I do consider myself really fortunate that I saw the red flags of, Monday morning to go into the office and having to have that beer just to settle the nerves or hair of the dog or whatever it was at that point. And still kind of in that like, all right, well, I just got to go hard this weekend for no reason. hypervigilance. Like if I was in a very crowded spot, I had to have a couple shots just to be able to handle it and deal with it. Um, and yeah, it just seemed to be getting progressively worse. So just a,
So as this got worse, um, it sounds like mostly, or was it, was the alcohol consumption getting worse, or all the above?
yeah. So it was just a lot of anxiety. So that would go into like panic attacks where I just would have to like lock myself in and not see anybody. Just complete dread.
Which then leads to,
And led to severe depression where I'd just be, Friday night staring at the ceiling, couldn't watch Netflix, couldn't even put on music just because it was like such a gray world. There was nothing that could distract me. And it was just this kind of like blandness, right? Um, my job at some point started losing purpose, working my ass off and what's the point kind of thing. So it was just that. And I that was one of the red flags. I just got to the end of the week and um, it was that thought of like I was more unhappy, I was more depressed more of the days this week than I was happy, which is a sheet to have.
yeah.
And I was just in that the alcohol was obviously it makes it worse. It's one of those tricky things about trauma is it alcohol helps, but it also makes it worse. Or certain things help, but they also make it worse. And so you get into this, but it's also there's not great other tools.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of goes into my VA experience, Department of Veteran Affairs, where I knew I was abusing alcohol. But it was also that consideration where like I said, if I'm in that situation time and I just can't go to sleep and I can't even like distract myself with anything, my choices are just to stare at the ceiling the whole night or to drink until I pass out.
Mm-hmm.
And at least with the latter, you feel happy and joyful for that. It was like I knew it wasn't the good choice, but it was like what
Yeah.
option do I have?
100%, man. Yeah. And I love, well, I don't love it, but I like on this podcast when people talk about what depression and anxiety feels like, because I feel so often those words, but to actually describe the things like you're saying, right? I had the same exact experience, right? It being a Friday night, me being too anxious to, nor do I want to see people. I feel like I couldn't be alone enough, even when I was by myself, and just that grayness, right? Not, like you said, what's the point of Netflix if it can't even make me laugh, or I can't, I'm so deep in my own head and my own thoughts that it's like, I don't even want to watch anything else, So
Yeah, it's almost more. It's weird. It's almost when you're in that state, it's almost like an annoyance even to have things that you normally enjoy. It's a very weird. It's it's um it's a whirlpool almost too. Is you get sucked in and you get deeper and deeper into it, like with anxiety. It starts off and you're a little bit, but then your brain focuses on that, and then you're anxious about being anxious, and then dread of like what if this never goes away, and then the next thing you know you're just in full on like panic mode.
Dude, yeah, I remember being in that state, talking to Lucas, our producer, and just being like, I didn't tell him this, but I was like, I'm never gonna do the podcast again. Like, 38 challenge is fucked. Like, I'm not people. Like, everything's going to shit. And it's just like, and I truly believe that. And that's the crazy part is like your brain allows you to believe those things, and but everyone else around you knows that that's not true, and that you're gonna make it through it, right? But you don't want you just can't hear it because it's this lens of depression, and whether rumination and this negative feedback loop. Did you ever have the thought of suicide? Did that ever that thought ever come up to you?
Yeah, fortunately no. I mean, like it's kind of weird. There's dynamics
Yeah.
where it comes up, but it was never a possibility for me.
Yeah. Right.
For me, it was just always like, okay, this is my lot in life, and I'm just gonna hard charge this.
Right.
Of I could never do that to my family, I could never do that to my friends, and I think this is also that kind of dumb veteran ranger sort of thing, which has helped me to this day. It's just like, this is shitty, but I'm not gonna let it beat me.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I think the only reason I asked that is because you mentioned like the anxiety makes anxiety worse. And for me, obviously my brother took his life and I was in the same boat. This isn't an option. But the fact that the ideation came up scared me so much that I would think about it more. And then you start thinking about it more and more and it's like, why? Like I'm not going to do this. I don't want to do this. Why am I thinking about doing it? And it's just like it's just, yeah, like you said, it's such a hard place. But as both of us know, the other side is so sweet, and I'm glad that I went through it because now we can speak the same language.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's you brought up a good point too. Is the brain's, it's all our perceived reality. Not to get too esoteric, but we're at the psychedelic.
Yeah.
But it's all perceived reality.
Right.
And how you perceive reality can actually change day by day. And if you're perceiving it, even if the day before this is like the manic depressive kind of thing, where you can be like everything's great and happy, and then the next day you can just be in this such great world. But then how it interprets
Everything.
everything that comes in, and it's almost like you're in this like bubble, and it's nearly impossible to see outside of that bubble.
Dude.
And that's the scary thing for a lot of people, is because it's not the question of it gets better or worse. That's change. For me, is this gonna be the future?
My forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's I understand why people take their life because you can't see an end of the darkness, but there's always an end to it, which, like you said, in that spot, you can't see it. But yeah, I remember just, I tell a story. I guess it hasn't been that long since I've done it, but there's a book called Winning the War in Your Mind that I always recommend people who are in this spot, and just is a kind of immersive. So it's journaling throughout it, but it asks, right? You do a thought audit on your thoughts throughout the day. Are they building you up? Are you tearing you down? So the first time I went through it was right after my brother died. Just started the 38 challenge. So, I was grieving, but I wasn't depressed and I wasn't anxious, and I was hard charging this new, foundation. So my answers were, yeah, my thoughts are building me up. Right. And I went through the book for the third time. The second time was very similar to the first. The third time was through when I was going through my anxiety and depression. And the answers to those questions were so much different. Like, are my thoughts building me up? It's like, my thoughts, like, yeah, just, like, it's so hard to put into words. But for me, being able to see the two different responses, it just goes to back exactly what you're saying. And then I did ketamine. What ketamine does, as you know, is it's a dissociative. So it disassociated my lens of depression and how I was viewing the world just for a little bit, so that I could understand that it's like, okay, like this is how I should be thinking. And it's like, you need to be kinder to yourself. I didn't really have anything that was too, but just being able to escape that depressive reality for an hour was life-changing, game-changing. So on that note, I'm curious, what helped you get out of this darkness that you were in?
Yeah, so like I said, I was in that spot. I was fortunate that I identified the red flags, and I identified like this is not going to end up well.
This is not normal. Yeah.
Yeah, and I knew if I continued on that trajectory, like whatever happened, it wouldn't be good. So that's when I sought help from the VA. Went there. It took a while for me to get rated. So I did get like a PTSD rating, but it was just kind of a sort of a 20-question survey. It was like, are you angry? And do you have nightmares? And then they're like, okay, great, you have PTSD. I'm like, cool, awesome. It's rubber stamp. It was like veteran trauma. Never once mentioned my exposure to blast. Never once mentioned my diet,
Which is crazy.
my social connections. Like it was just the very baseline, because that's kind of how it operates. That's like a green check mark for the VA stuff. So I got rated. So it was like, okay, well, I have free mental health services. I'm clearly not tackling this, whatever is going on right now, effectively. Let me talk to a therapist, right? Let's talk to.
When you went into the VA, did they put you on any medications, or did you?
So initially, so I had an appointment, and they initially like do an intake, right? And so got a meeting with a social worker, and to her credit, she was very, you know, direct and point blank. And so I told her like, hey, I'm struggling with a lot of anxiety, all this kind of stuff. I'm good. I'm not suicidal. And you know, on the outside, I was still doing, showing up and performing at work and getting promotions. And you know, if you saw me on the outside, maybe you, if you knew me well, but for most people, like, oh yeah, he's doing great. And so, but that was probably also the narrative I was telling myself. And so I was like, hey, I'm fine, but I am struggling with this kind of stuff. But at that time, turn it around. So I was actively doing more holistic stuff, like going back, signing up to a gym, getting back in shape, cooking, eating healthier. I'd wake up early to journal and meditate. I was trying to do all this kind of stuff, and
Right.
and they helped, but there's still that wall. There's still that weight that I couldn't shake off. So I told this woman, and you know, she was very kind and listened. And you know, the VA does have amazing employees. It's just the nature of the system. And she and I, but I also told her, at this time, I just want to let you know or be clear that I'm not interested in taking medication. Just my own personal decision, research, due diligence. I felt like I understood when the time and the place was of how severe I was going through. And, you know, I've seen people that were greatly helped by medication, by SSRIs. I've also seen people that just became full on. It maybe potentially stopped them from killing themselves, but it also took the light out of their life or the creativity out of their life.
I saw a statistic that said that 1 in 3 veterans are prescribed 10 or more. And how does that not make you a zombie, right? If you're
Yeah.
taking this pill to solve this problem that gives you this other side effect, so you take another pill to solve that. And again, to depression, it's like, if you're numb, how much does it really help?
Yeah, and that was like the case, and that's like the veterans we serve, 10 to 15 different medications because you take the SSRI, and one of the most lucrative and prescribed drugs is an antipsychotic. So you take the SSRI, that can cause psychosis, and it can actually increase suicide ideation. So then they prescribe an antipsychotic, and so you have the Americans are by a medical standard considered psychotic by being prescribed this, or veterans. But it's not that they actually are. It's because of just how backwards in a lot of senses the medication system is.
So I take an SSRI currently. I'm gonna give it a couple, and then I'm gonna taper off of it. But when I was first prescribed it, they were like, yeah, just so you know, there's a black box warning on this for suicide. And I was like, well, I'm already kind of having those thoughts. Like, why would I take something that increases your likelihood of suicide? Like, oh, well, it gets worse before. If you think about how many people who are prescribed SSRI that it got worse when they were already in a bad state and they couldn't see it through. I mean, yeah, it's like you said, the nature of the beast. And again, I'm not against medications. I think that they definitely have saved millions of lives, but you know, they've also taken too.
Absolutely, and people shouldn't, you know, just people should do their own research and figure out what's best for them, and talk with their doctors. You know, generally speaking, there are great doctors, and the doctors are just using the tools they have, right? Yeah, so I was in that situation, and for me, that was, you know, in terms of scaling, that was a little bit further down, right? Like, it didn't. Can I just talk to a therapist? That seems like the logical next step for my own mental health, right? And so I made that pretty clear to that I wasn't willing to do that at that point. And so she was like, okay, well, let me be honest with you. Like, I can get you to see a therapist, more than likely. Your condition and what you told me in your rating, that they'll recommend, prescribe medication, SSRIs. And I forget what the specific term is, but it's essentially like they have a protocol of effective care, right? And if you don't protocol of effective care, then there's limit to what they can do in terms of help. So she was like, I can do that. If you still decide that you don't want medication, then realistically you can only get a couple, like 4 therapy sessions. And she also was like, and then other than that, we sure, and this is what we recommend. And it's exactly what I was doing: meditate, journaling, all this kind of stuff, you know? So she's like, you're already on that. And so I can do that, have you see a therapist, but this is the nature of it. And they're at over capacity. And, they did have some group therapy. Like, just to be honest, that's like the one that we have here. It's people that are kind of in the more extreme set. So I don't think it will help you. So I just kind of walked away from that. It was just like, okay, well, 4 therapy sessions is not going to get you anywhere. Like, you can't even know your therapist in that amount of time. And it was just sort of a reaffirmation of the VA, or not the VA, but the professionals didn't seem to know what was going on. It was just, you have PTSD. This is the only way that you can potentially like maintain it. And if you don't do that, then there's nothing else. And that's the other dynamic of it too, which is why I rejected it, is it really does get put to you as a maintenance program. There's some people that can overcome PTSD or whatever the mental health issue through therapy, but there is also that of this might just be something you have to deal with and figure out. And the medication, there's not a lot of instances where it heals you. It's more that it numbs or subsides the issues, the thing, so you can operate, right? And I really didn't like that. You have this and you're not necessarily going to be able to get over it, but we can help you maintain.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like I have grade 4 arthritis in my knee in some parts, and it's just pain management. Like, you at some point you're gonna. Doctor said, I was like, I definitely don't like that answer, but there's things out there that are different rehab programs that begin to make the things around the knee stronger, right? And there's things like stem cells which are coming out, which are now being proven to repair the knee. And it's the same thing with the mind, right? There's things that you can do that can just pain management, right? That you can actually begin to heal, which is, why I love the work that y'all are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's especially in mental health. There is this sort of Western medicine, if they don't know what the answer is, then there doesn't exist an answer. Or if it goes outside of the medication spectrum, then it's bullshit, right? So we see examples of that with psychedelics now. It's starting to change. But we saw the same sort of thing where a lot of these like more ancient practices or remedies, a lot of these more holistic things are now kind of being rediscovered, quote unquote, and it took Western medicine to catch up to things that have been known for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. For instance, go back 20 years and you said you did yoga, or we would be calling you like goddamn hippie, especially in the military, right? Yeah. But now it's like trained in the military. Yep. Breath work, meditation too. If you said you meditate, now the military incorporates meditation practices, cold plunges, all these. It's in vogue right now. It's like human optimization. All of these things were very traditional treatments, and because there was not a clinical study around it, because there was not a doctor's green check mark on it,
and $1 billion behind a new drug. Yeah,
I remember reading yoga is bullshit, but now it's super accepted.
So, your work with, so I guess, the place that you were at, you had this experience with the VA, and it sounds like you were kind of doing your own searching for answers. And from the looks of it, it sounds like an answer for you, and an answer that's helped a lot of people. So, for your mental health journey, what was your first experience with psychedelics, and how helpful were they?
So I was in that situation walking out of the VA, and I'm like, all right, well, these people don't seem to know, and I'm still struggling. I didn't have an answer, right? But I didn't want to stop searching. And I just happened to hear another podcast, like a Joe Rogan podcast, and they were with a guest talking about ayahuasca. And at first, I just kind of listened to it with entertainment kind of value, and it was more about the and seeing this crazy stuff. And at that point, I had no interest in psychedelics. I didn't see the point. For me, it viewed like escapism. I had friends in college or in high school that did it, and I was like, cool, man. That doesn't actually I had the pride of not having done cannabis or psychedelics. That you know, um, in my mind at that point, I didn't mind. I didn't care if anybody else did it. But if I took drugs and I became a drug user, and that was a different self view than I had at that point. So I heard this podcast, and I kind of cast it off. There was some talk about its benefits and all this, but it was kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah, right. Excuse to take drugs.
Yeah. But it planted a seed, and for whatever reason, I think just bored at work, and then like looking more into it and reading more and more interesting things, and
Doing your due diligence.
yeah, and like I said, I think if it was like somebody offering me LSD, like a bag of mushrooms, I wouldn't have done it. But the fact that I'd previously been to South America and I loved it, and the fact that this had ayahuasca had this culture, this tradition, this ceremony, this thing that dates back for thousands of years and has been used by millions of all over South America. I think that gave me that window. Like, this is not just taking drugs. It's not just this recreational thing. There's something to it. Like, at the very least, it's a cultural exploration, right? Like, you're doing this unique thing with this interesting culture, and so that gave me it was one of those things of my subconscious to do it, and so it just took that time to convince the dumber part of my brain that we were actually doing this. At that time, I was already ready to leave my job. I was it just wasn't inspiring, intriguing, challenging. Um, and just where I was at, like, I had nothing to preserve. I didn't have friendship. I didn't, I had some friend network, but there just wasn't really that much keeping me there. Right. And, fortunately I had some savings. I was like, all right, well, let's just clean slate and try again. Cause this experiment that I was doing definitely didn't work. And ayahuasca. So again, did my due diligence, and this was 2017, which is not too long ago, but very night and day in terms of the psychedelic space, where there wasn't a lot of opinions. You just had to go to these different websites of like, which retreat should I go? How am I not going to get kidnapped? Like, how do you do this? And some of them were super touristy, of like dolphin, go see the dolphins, go through a forest walk, go see this and that. But I found one that seemed much more traditional. The website was built in the 1990s and never updated, but had a lot of great information, had an application, and just trying to get your money. And I was like, okay, this seems like the one. So just took that leap of faith of like, all right, I'm going to book a one-way ticket to Peru, get rid of what I don't need, start off with this ayahuasca journey, and take it from there. And so the next thing I know, I'm in the middle of the Amazon in Iquitos, Peru, and at this ayahuasca ceremony, or yeah, at this retreat center, and thinking a little bit like, are you crazy? This sounds a little bit crazy, but also feeling relief of getting out of that bubble that I created, which became much clearer the moment I stepped out of it.
So what was that first experience like for you?
So with the ayahuasca experience, and for people unfamiliar, ayahuasca comes from the Amazon jungle. It's the combination of two plants. One's a vine, one's a leaf. The vine contains something called an MAO inhibitor, and the leaf contains something called DMT. And the DMT is the psychoactive compound, but the MAO inhibitor allows your body to metabolize it to where you actually have it. If you just ate the leaf with the DMT, because there's many plants that actually have an effect, right? So it's this combination, and it's brewed down to this really dense tea, essentially, which doesn't taste good at all. And you drink that, and then you go into a very classical psychedelic experience for 4 to 5 hours, led by healers that generally sing during the ceremonies, and they sing these songs called Icaros that are um, songs they learn from the plants, from their relationship with the plants. Because these tribes in the jungle, their whole livelihood, their whole life is on nature, right? And so the healers, they're it's kind of being associated with psychedelics, but they're also the ones that, if you had stomach trouble, if you had, an infected wound, if you had this or that, they can go into the jungle and find the tree, find the plant that would help that.
They're doctors essentially.
Yeah, essentially. And so the ayahuasca or the psychedelics was part of, for them in a lot of ways, mental health, but oftentimes that's very closely tied to spiritual health, in terms of their conception of how the world works and their religious practices. And so it's becoming one and moving energy, moving spirit sometimes from, and there's different beliefs, there's different, but it's, mind, body, spirit, health is what they're charged with of the tribe. And so went there, 4 ceremonies over the course of a week. You're isolated in the middle of the jungle, generally speaking. And you do those ceremonies spread out through. You go there at night, you go up, drink the ayahuasca, go back to your mat in the corner. You're generally laying down, and then the the fireworks start. And so for me, never having done a psychedelic, and this being one of the more intense psychedelics that there are, it just hit me like a train. And it was the classical shapes, geometric patterns, colors, but it all came at me like super fast, super intense. Just felt like the world pulsating and not in a comfortable way. So that first,
In an uncomfortable way.
yeah,
Yeah,
it was absolutely uncomfortable.
That was my first experience with ketamine too. I was like, this is not comfortable.
Yeah, and it was just everything. It was every dynamic of being uncomfortable and just puking the whole time, and just complete brain chaos and all this kind of stuff, and it just threw me through a whirlwind, and just overwhelming. And what psychedelics do, and learning this and appreciating it later, is they're essentially augmenters. They make you super sensitive. So your hearing increases, your sight increases, which is why they do it in darkness. Have trauma or certain emotions, those are going to be augmented as well. Those are going to be, a big thing, which is why they can be effective for mental health. And so for me, I was essentially just being surrounded in this, volume level to 10 anxiety, chaos, which I was already holding, but it was processing through my body in this very sensory, all-encompassing way.
That's fascinating, and I don't know why I didn't really think about that either for my ketamine experience, but I had a panic attack during my treatment. You can't really I'm sure it was the same with ayahuasca, but it's not like you can really move or get up and do stuff. So it's like you have to feel it, right? And you have to try your damn best to breathe through it and tell yourself that you're not going to die. But that's so important because that's the way that life is, right? You're going to have points in your life where you're best, and you have to be able to work through it and to keep taking steps forward and to understand that you're going to be okay and that, this too shall pass. For your ayahuasca journey, did you feel like you processed a lot of trauma, or did you feel like you mostly just processed the feelings of anxiety?
No, I felt like I got the shit beaten out of me. Essentially it. So after the first one, I was just like, what the hell was that? But so a couple of things. One, there's also this depth, and there's this beyond the chaos. There's ancientness. There's a depth to it. It was complex. It wasn't just taking drugs. It wasn't more to it, right? It wasn't recreational by any means. The second thing was, coming from that ranger mentality, when you get the shit beat out of you, it gives you respect, it gives you a little bit of humility. And so from that, it was I think that's helped that drug mentality that I went there of oh, you're doing psychedelics, you're now this person. So coming from that, I was just didn't know what it was, but I was there's something to this.
Yeah.
And
you respected it.
Yeah. And it was and I was there, I was fully committed. I was I'm here. I'm not going to tap out. So then the second ceremony, even worse. And to the degree of like, it felt like it brought me on the edge of insanity. Of course, like I said, that was an augmentation of my fear. So, because if that's what you're fearing, then that's what you have to face.
I was gonna say, do you think the second one was worse because now you knew what it felt like and you were kind of anticipating to go into that spot?
There's a little bit of that, but there's also this retreat center purposely made a stronger combination for the second retreat. Also, your body keeps the ayahuasca in, so it tends to build, kind of like primers you.
Same thing with ketamine. Yeah. They start low and then you work your way up.
Yeah, and so the second one was just that. So they and we do similar sort of things. We like to have the bigger experiences, and the first one's story arc, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where that by the end you can kind of wrap it up, but sometimes the first few ones you get your ass kicked, and because that's oftentimes where the work happens. And so that was that, and then put me to this, like, showed me the fear of God in a lot of different ways, and still when you're in that chaotic mode, you're like, this is about, because it wasn't like an image, or it wasn't like this happened with your parents, or this happened with
it's
your
nothing profound, which is what I was expecting.
Yeah.
Again, ketamine's on the lowest end of the intensity, but still, yeah, I was like, I'm going to see my brother, I'm going to talk to him, and I'm going to work through all the stuff that I'm feeling. There's no magic pill, and there never will be. But yeah, like you said, it's this, it's just continuing to move through the trauma and the feelings and all that stuff. So, all right, so now you're on your third treatment.
And just a real quick comment on that too. A lot of Western mental health is really based off of using the brain to process our traumas, which kind of makes sense from some level of like, okay, this happened to me, let me talk through it. And that can be very effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, helping you reframe it, because the brain is, you can exercise it, and if you have happier thoughts and you force yourself, then it does do that. But consideration that a lot of our trauma is stored outside of our language centers of our brain. It's stored subconsciously with emotion. Like, emotion is the language of trauma, of how we're reacting to it. And like anything else, it can be very hard to explain an emotion because it's working on language set or different platform, right? Language could be very analog, and you're trying to explain something very, very complex. And so with psychedelics, what it does is it's almost bringing these emotions to the forefront. Like, language doesn't serve you anything in experience. It has no value, it has no practice, but you're exploring this and metaphorically looking at it, and almost like enhanced dream, like where you're seeing this and it might not necessarily mean, or might not represent exactly what it is. Like, you might see an animal, a figure, or this. It's an interpretation of the emotion, the trauma, the feeling, right? And so helping you process that really doesn't matter what the image is or the language or the words you are using. The whole point is processing the trauma, processing the feeling, right? It's not that I knew this happened. It's more that I've been storing this. And let's get past that and also learn how to feel better about it. So the third one started off like, and I was, like I said, had the fear of God in my eyes. Like, I don't know if I can handle anything more intense than that other one.
I did 6 ketamine treatments in a week, and I was so drained.
Absolutely. And other people were too, so that kind of was a little bit of saving grace. So I went into it, started off like just as strong. I'm like, oh shit, like another night of this. During that, it was almost, I saw this hand pull me out, this like plant portal, and then going from this chaos, like sweating, uncomfortable, couldn't sit still, like complete uncomfortability, complete like misery, to absolute tranquility in an instant. Even the heart rate down, going from sweating to feeling like a cool breeze on my face, and just peace at Zen, seeing like, a nice beach, and just absolute stillness and absolute peace, tranquility. And I was like, oh, okay. the self-sabotaging parts of our brain was like but what if it go back? The moment that what if came back, zoom right back into the chaos and all this kind of stuff. And then so through the rest of the night, it was almost like it was teaching me how to stay in that state. And being hard-headed, it took me a lot of just puking and all this kind of stuff. And by the end, when I was like just tapped out and exhausted, felt like I got there, but at least I made progress, right? Like that was a victory, and I felt that. So then for the fourth ceremony was sort of a continuation of that. A little bit of struggle, but then I able to stay in that. And once without that self-sabotaging thought, and then it was just like a very nice experience, and again, more feeling oriented, less things that I can dictate, but I almost reconnect me to that warrior spirit, that sort of noble feeling, that strength, that lion heart kind of thing, and I was just living in that. And then towards the end of that ceremony, there was some insights in terms of, I was trying to ask it like, what's next? Like, what's my path? What should I be? And it was just that clear message of just if you knew exactly what you're doing, if you knew exactly what the next path looked like, you would go back into depression, right? Because this whole purpose of life is that it should be challenging. It should challenge your creativity. It should challenge who you are, and you have a skill set to do that. But if you knew exactly, like you see with uber rich people, like they're depressed because they don't have that challenge anymore, right? They won the Monopoly game. And so it was just that sort of realization of like, take it step by step, enjoy the challenge while you're doing it, give yourself some grace. But that's the whole mystery dynamic of life. So, sign on. It's going to be hard. It's going to be fun. It's going to be everything in between. And so, and again, with these messages, when it does come like that, and we see this with a lot of veterans, I can tell you like, hey, love yourself, or hey, great. But unless you internalize, unless you tell yourself that, not just on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, if you feel that, if you feel the love for yourself, when I felt that release of, hey, I don't need to know what's next and life's a journey, when you feel level, it's a whole different level of processing, and it just has a much bigger impact on how you perceive things.
Right. So, and yeah, that's so fascinating. And I mean, even, things like meditation, things like breathing, cold, you're trying to get to the same place, right? And obviously it just sounds like in ayahuasca, your experience was a profound kind of version of that. So after this retreat, what was life like?
So like I said, I bought a one-way ticket. So bumming around South America and just doing odd jobs here and there and just trying to figure out what the next thing was. I had no idea. It was like maybe...
Were you depressed or anxious at this point now after the...
No, I felt great. Immediately afterwards, I felt like the weight had been lifted. I felt clear. My brain for the... kind of goes to the traumatic brain injury from being a mortarman. Wasn't diagnosed, but for sure something that was a factor. But it felt like my brain after that experience was the first time it was working as a cohesive unit as it should. And, to understand that when I was in it, because if you're working with a brain that's not working, that's all right? Whereas afterwards, like, oh, this is different from that, like my brain's not sabotaging, it's not misfiring, all cylinders are actually firing how they should, and this vehicle is going forward. And so your delineation between the pre and post. When I went, and this kind of leads to what I'm doing now, when you go to retreat and you're there and they take great care of you, but after that, then you're on your own. And so one, going into it, there wasn't a lot of preparation. Two, getting out of it, there's some talks of integration or life after, but it's mostly on you to figure out. So I was fortunate I had space and I was in Latin America and, could do, I didn't have to go right back into like busy work lifestyle, but I also had to figure it out. And that involves stumbling regressing a little bit. That involves all sorts of stuff. But generally speaking, it was a positive trajectory. It was better than I was. And some of the biggest things was, one, the things like anxiety and depression didn't hit me as hard, or I didn't get sucked into that whirlpool that I mentioned. I could almost see it like from a satellite view. If something was triggering me, I could see that coming and sidestep it. So with the anxiety, like not getting into that feedback loop, and that's with the ayahuasca experience. That's kind of what it taught me. It was almost this exercising this muscle of, instead of self-sabotaging, instead of getting anxious, this kind of stuff, you can change the script. You can go to that peaceful spot. And now that I actually knew how to trigger that in my head, I could utilize that, right? It was my choice, but I didn't have the tools to make it my choice before. And to the point where, I eventually at some point later in that year went back to Tampa where I was before, and I was at the local bar just to say hi to some friends. And the social anxiety, like I said, where I had to take drinks before, wasn't there. And it just didn't hit me that way. And so I could be there with peace without shots. And so I was traveling around afterwards and just trying to figure it out as I was going, but didn't really have a specific direction. But I was happy. I was doing well. I was taking care of myself.
So when did you start your work? When did the thought of creating a nonprofit that would allow warriors to and their families to experience what you did?
So it came to this point where, after I didn't tell anybody I was going, just because I didn't want their judgment on that. So afterwards, my family and told some friends, some people that were still in or recently retired. At this point, too, I already had double-digit people that I served with had taken their own lives, So I was very aware that there was a huge problem, and it was just increasing. So I started talking to buddies that were in, and I was like, hey, and more often than not, they're like, yeah, that's sounds stupid and crazy, but if it works, it works. And I was kind of surprised of this sort of mentality of like, hey man, yeah, it's like tools on the ground. Like and it makes sense now, but at that point it was surprising. We're trained for that. You can plan and plan, but you have to complete mission. And that means, adapt and overcome. You use the tools that are at your disposal. And this really seemed to fit into that category for most people. And it started becoming this almost obligation where I just started having these thoughts of, hey, you just went through something crazy, but something to a lot of people that need it. And so it was a question of like, can this help people? And number two, do you actually have the ability to make that possible? And both of those were an unavoidable yes. I was like, shit, well, I guess I got to do something about it now. I had the dreams as anybody else of this and making money and retiring early, but it was just that obligation of, it was almost like I stumbled on this knowledge that it was my charter to share with veterans. And so I figured out what that meant. And what that seemed to mean was, and I can guarantee you at that time, starting a nonprofit was in no way appealing to me, especially with dwindling resources in my bank account, which were never a huge amount in the first place. And starting a nonprofit around a very illegal, stigmatized substance was not a career choice that I recommend to anybody. But there I was in Colombia and just kind of figuring out, and went on LegalZoom and how do you start a nonprofit, and figured out the pathway there and figured out how to build a website. And I was literally in this small town in Colombia and figuring it out. And a few months after my first experience, launched Heroic Hearts Project to educate veterans. And then also potentially, at that point it's too early to tell, but I wanted to connect them to retreats. Like I said, all the due diligence that I did, a lot of people, be hard for them to find a good center, or if they're not used to traveling, like what should they do? And also what I mentioned, that I didn't have this preparation or aftercare, maybe that should be incorporated in it. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest thing is, like any other, like we were talking about athletes before, there's subgroups, right? Like if you're a doctor and you're surrounded by other doctors, you're going to use very, medically related terms. The same thing with veterans, or athletes. You're going to have similar languages or similar ways of viewing the world or describing things. And I knew that needed to be done for psychedelic. And I felt like I could direct that in a very straightforward way to other veterans. So, and I started it and looked into it, and there wasn't any other vet program out there that was doing this, that was actively serving it. There's like some small subgroups, but extent. And so I just kind of put it out there and started the website. And April of 2017, April 1st, April Fool's Day, I did the official launch of Heroic Hearts Project.
One of the things I want to comment on, you mentioned tools, and I had a really, really, really good friend of mine reach out, which I'm so proud that he did. And he was like, I listened to your podcast, and I kind of detailed the darkness that I was in. He was like, I feel like I'm in this spot right now. I'm in that funk that I no longer feel like myself. He goes, what's your advice? Or what's one thing that helped you? And I think what people need to understand with depression, with anxiety, with mental battles, the first thing you need to understand is that it's going to be really hard and it's not going to happen overnight, but you will get better. Like 100%, you will get better. The second that you need to arm yourself with as many tools as possible, right? Exercise isn't going to be the thing that cures you. It will help a lot. Meditation won't cure you. It'll help a lot. Good diet, cold exposure, social. All these things are tools, and you need to utilize all of them in order to get out of the funk. And I think arguably psychedelics could be the most powerful tool that we have in our arsenal. So I absolutely love what you and Heroic Hearts are doing. So tell us about high level what that journey's looked like, where you guys are at now.
Yeah, the journey looks like the most uphill battle you could possibly imagine, but always fulfilling too, of it actually having an impact, and to kind of emphasize what you said, we're not seeing anything else, the impact that this has to the same degree, and it really is transforming the global view of mental health and trauma, and actually giving people their life back in a rather rapid time frame. So yeah, what Heroic Hearts has become, it quickly took a life of its own, and it's been a whirlwind of an experience. And especially at that point, again, not too long ago, but night and day in the psychedelic space, where cold calling people and their response was like, "You're doing what with veterans? How did you get my? Why are you doing that? Sounds crazy." And just putting it and talking to veterans, and really wasn't being talked about. And then eventually, after Michael Pollan's book, after the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Center started, and some of their research came out, MAPS, MDMA research was around 2018, 2019, just became night and day, where, I was having to work extra just to bring this word to veterans and people in general, because I needed funding, to where people had already heard about it, or word of mouth, and other veterans and success stories and other nonprofits emerged that were doing similar things for their subgroups, and so it was kind of cool to see the dichotomy between almost a before and afterwards. And so what it looks like now is, again, still educating, meeting with veterans, going to conferences like this, and just presenting it in a way that I think is very approachable to veterans, that they understand, and we have similar backgrounds, and my team is filled with veterans. And then also our program, which, is unique and the first of its kind, where veterans come to us. We do essentially like a harm reduction intake of where they're at, issues, medications, all this kind of stuff, and seeing if this is actually advisable for them, because there are a lot of contraindications and health considerations. And If they're good, green light. We do 4 to 6 weeks of preparation work, which involves 3 group calls. So they get to meet everybody else. We go over logistics. They get to ask their questions, and we talk about breath work, mindfulness, all this kind of stuff. And each person gets 3 individual peer support coaching beforehand, and then they get 3 group and 3 individual afterwards as well after the retreat. So we do that 4 to 6 weeks of preparation. They get all this training, they get this diet, all this kind of stuff. So when they get there, they're ready to hit the ground running. There's no way to fully prep somebody for this because it's individual to each individual, but we can at least give them like different tools to handle it. We have vetted retreat centers around the world that we've worked with. We test them out, make sure they're safe, make sure they're aligned, and developed, our own sort of protocols of how we have found that work best with trauma. So big backbone of what we do is ayahuasca, but we also have worked with psilocybin, ibogaine, and other psychedelics. And so they go to these retreats, and generally about a week long, and then that aftercare, that integration to a community where once they get through that, that's really what we're trying to build is, and an ideal in the future when these become legal in the US, we can have a localized community where one, they have affordable access to whatever psychedelic, but two, they can keep tapping into this other group of veterans that can continue to support, find purpose, find support, and support other veterans that are in need. So that's really the big thing. The other dynamics we do are research. So we have some pretty innovative research projects with various universities like Imperial College of London, University of Texas, University of Georgia, and then so a lot of the statewide and some federal policies that have passed in the U.S. We've generally played a pretty active role in that. So here in Colorado, we helped pass the bill that will allow clinical access to psilocybin in 2 years, and also decriminalization right now as in a similar. And so this year in Oregon, from a bill that we helped pass, people actually right now can go get psilocybin therapy from in a clinical setting, which is pretty remarkable. So those are the main things, but obviously our main operation is connecting that. And we also just reached an organization called the Hope Project, which provides support counseling to spouses. So the veterans that go on our retreat, their partners, they also get coaching, they also get involved with it, and then they also have access to their own individualized retreats if they choose that.
Yeah, and I love that partnership with the Hope Project because I think for me, the two, I mean, besides the way that psychedelics are now beginning to have more evidence that they actually repair the brain, but just the way that they work in the brain, right? Increasing neuroplasticity and just the different functions that they tap into. But for me, what I love about your program is that it provides hope, right? When someone's in that spot, all they want is hope, right? All they want to see is a future where maybe they're better. And so when you have this preparation work where they're doing this for 4 to 6 weeks, if someone was in the point in their life or just in such a dark spot, well, now they have 4 weeks where they're preparing for something that could completely change their life, right? And that provides hope. And for some people, that's enough, right? And then two, I always like talking about this because I'm a Christian myself, and I think there's this stigma against taking and psychedelics, and a lot of people like you. I think your initial viewpoint was you're escaping something, right? Or you're numbing something. But what psychedelics do is they force you to face your trauma and face your emotions head on, right? Like you were mentioning. And so, in my opinion, it's really the only drugs or treatments or medications, whatever you want to call it, that actually does that. And SSRI numbs it, right? Benzodiazepines numb these feelings, right? And these right now are first line of defense. And so that's why I just absolutely commend you for what you're doing and backing off of hope. What to you, just the research that you guys have done, your success rates, like what are some things that you can tell listeners for what you're finding and the hope that it can provide them?
Yeah, so I mean, generally in the space, fortunately, there's a lot of growing research a not traditional psychedelic, but it's about to be passed by the FDA for PTSD, and it has had north of 67% success rate with treatment-resistant PTSD, so the hardest of the hardest cases, and that's a huge jump from our current available treatments. We're seeing some very positive results from psilocybin and some like that's being studied. We're seeing so far pretty positive results.
Like night and day.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
night and day.
Yeah, huge increases, and not only are they showing efficacy, but they're also like relieving the symptoms. They're taking away the PTSD or the depression, where as opposed to the maintenance, it, and they're also having broad-based benefits, whether it's helping addiction or physical issues or depression, and there's very few medications that have more than one use. So these are pretty remarkable from that context. We're doing one of our studies is with we have two studies with them. So one's psilocybin for traumatic brain injury. So we did the first cohort of veterans in Jamaica with Beckley retreats. And then another one is ayahuasca. So ayahuasca for PTSD. And so we have an initial cohort of preliminary results, and these are observational studies, but still very valuable data and validated. And so we've seen statistically significant improvements by a wide degree for PTSD, depression, and improvements in quality of life and anxiety. And see similar things with the too early on the psilocybin study, but we have like cognitive assessment measurements, EEGs. So we're getting a lot of like great data. And then we're doing another study with an organization called Onaya Health, looking into epigenetics with the University of Texas. We're doing a 3-part study. So psilocybin for Gould Star wives, so spouses that lost a loved one, so prolonged depression. Another one, ayahuasca for PTSD as well, and then ibogaine for veterans with head trauma.
Do you know the percentage of people who go through your program that the ayahuasca or I guess other psychedelics are effective for?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of more of a back of the envelope number because we have various studies, so it's kind of compiling it, but just kind of what we see from the different results, and you have to kind of separate like studies, world data. I'd easily say 90, mid 90% of people that go through our program at the retreat or like post retreat have some sort of positive impact of. Sometimes it's complete transformation of life. Sometimes it's new self-understanding. But in terms of impact, it's a very high percent. And then the other small percent